Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Whay podcast, and today I'm joined by author, poet and academic Mandy Haggith. Hello Mandy.
Hello, thanks for having me here.
Oh, a pleasure. And you are here because The Lyre Dancer, which is the third and final novel of the Stone Stories Trilogy, has just recently been published by Saraband Books.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Yeah. So I thought, because I see the Stone Stories as a real trilogy, and I think you really need to read all three of them, to get the major picture. So with that in mind, before we talk about the Lyre Dancers, can we go right back to the beginning and the Walrus Mutterer? Why did you decide to begin these books?
Okay, so I live in Assynt. I am the luckiest person in the world. I get to live in what Norman Mackay called this most beautiful corner of the land. And just up the coast from here, a few miles up the coast, is an Iron Age monument, so a ruin of a broch. So it would have been a 40-foot tall, double-walled tower more than 2,000 years ago. And so I was involved as a local interested person in a project run by Historic Assynt, which is our local history group, excavating it, and got really, really excited about that whole period of the Iron Age and what was going on there, what the culture was here, realized that people were, a really sophisticated maritime culture. And then I discovered that there was this guy called Pytheas who was from the Mediterranean, so part of the Greek Empire, who traveled around in 320 BC. And he took measurements as he went along of how far north he was. And one of them is exactly here.
Wow.
And so then that triggered me off with the whole thing of like, oh, so was Pytheas here? I mean, literally, did he make landfall? And that seemed, everybody basically said yes, including Professor Barry Cunliffe, who's the kind of world expert on Pytheas, said it's perfectly plausible that, yeah, he came. And the excavation was showing that broch was up probably when he would have come. And that seemed to me a fantastic premise for a work of imagination to ask, well, who did he meet? And what happened when this man from the Greek Empire turned up in Iron Age Celtic Scotland? So that was it, really.
I didn't realise it was so closely based on real history. That's fascinating to know. Mm-hmm. So was it always going to be a trilogy? Was this something that was as big as that, or did you just start with the first book and see where it went?
Yeah, I kind of started with the first book, and I mean, my question was, well, who did he meet? So then everybody except Pytheas in the book is fictional, because we don't have any. He's the only historical character in the sense that he wrote a book. We know what he did, where he was from, and quite a lot about him. But we don't know anything about. The book is lost, by the way. If anybody finds a copy of On the Ocean from more than 2,000 years ago, then that would be very exciting. But everybody else is made up. So I started up by thinking, well, okay, so let's have who's the woman he met. And so that was Rianne, and then once I'd got her, then the novel started to unfold, and then as it turned out, it became a very large thing that was in 3 parts, because I wanted to explore not only what was going on from the perspective of people who were living here when Pytheas arrived, but also what the world was like from his point of view, and then it turned out what was the world like from other people's points of view as well. And so kind of because of the fact that I got involved in multiple perspectives, then it turned into this kind of 3-part piece. But it wasn't until I actually submitted it for publication to Saraband that the decision was finally taken that it would actually be 3 separate books rather than one great big fat one.
Right, I see.
So, yeah.
And you talk about multiple perspectives, and that really does run throughout the trilogy. Often subsequent chapters are different characters and like their look and what's going on. But interesting to me is the Amber Seeker, which is the middle one, is really Pytheas's story.
Yeah.
And when I read that, I thought, well, this is really brave and interesting, because he's not exactly the most likable character to have around, and yet you're giving his side of the story, if you like. Now knowing that he's the real character, that kind of makes a bit more sense. But was that something that you always wanted to do? Because at the beginning, it's not necessarily his story.
No, that's right. I started the writing from Pythias's point of view as a bit of an experiment, just to try to get to understand him a bit more, and that's how that whole kind of volume came about. And also because of the fact that the middle volume, the Amber Seeker, actually starts before the Walrus Mutterer in chronological time. Because it includes the bit of his journey from the Mediterranean all the way up to northern Scotland. And it carries on after the end of the Walrus Mutterer because it takes him all the way back home again. And so I wanted to kind of find out what the rest of his journey involved and cover that. So that's how that section came about. I do feel somewhat guilty about, as you say, he's not the most likable character, and there's a sense in which I've kind of sullied the reputation of this historical explorer in a way that sometimes does give me qualms, because I mean, there's a lot of it which is based on the fragmentary evidence that we have got about the man himself, and surmise, and the research that particularly Barry Cunliffe has done. But there's also an awful lot of fiction in there, and I filled in a lot of the gaps with things which which made it a novel, and which were, for me, I think, ways. I'm fundamentally interested in culture clash and conceptual difference and distance, and the way in which different people see the world in different ways, and the kind of very central drama that plays out between Pythias and the fictional woman Rhiannon, who he meets in Ascent, was very much a kind of, it's a core thread in the book that I wanted to explore, and I really wanted to explore it from both the male and the female perspective, even though that's a kind of challenging thing to do.
Sure. There's a description of him in the first book as part child, part god, part something else, which I thought was an amazing kind of description of this person. This clash of cultures is very interesting, because I think, knowing only a little of the Iron Age of that time, you would not necessarily expect that this person from the Mediterranean would arrive in, because Ascent's right at the top of Scotland, for people that don't know, isn't it? It's
top left corner.
Top left corner, yeah. And so how unusual was that for someone to be from the Mediterranean to be around there, or was it more usual than I would think?
No, as far as we know, he was the first. So he was a really extraordinarily intrepid explorer. And it's interesting, it was at the same time that Alexander the Great was off kind of with his army off to the kind of Middle East, I guess he got as far as Afghanistan, didn't he? Whereas Pythias, as far as we're aware, he didn't have an army with him by any means at all. He was a lone explorer, as far as we can tell. And so, it's extraordinarily unusual. But we know that there were boats plying the waters, trading up and down the Atlantic coast. And there's lots of surmise in the book. I mean, things like, how he was traveling is a real issue. And it's completely implausible that he would have been in his own boat, because we know that the boats that would have plied the Mediterranean would not have been Atlantic seaworthy. He wouldn't have been able to cross the Bay of Biscay or whatever in a boat like that. So the likelihood is that he was actually hitching rides on existing boats that were plying trade up and around the Atlantic coast. And so hence he's traveling with a trader. So the fact that there would have been people moving up and down the coastline in boats, there would have been strangers, but the chances of them being all the way from the Mediterranean are diminishingly small, and he would have been very unusual in that sense.
How much did you relish the research? I mean, just going on to say, well, these boats that would have been in the Mediterranean wouldn't have made the journey. I speak to quite a few people who write historical novels, and I get the sense that they really relish the research.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of aspects to it. I mean, one of them was I got hired by the team of archaeologists who were doing the dig at Clachtolbroch over several digs over the best part of a decade, really, and to write the blog. So I used to write the dig diary, which was great fun, and meant that I could sit and tap the brains of the archaeological team on a kind of ongoing basis as I was writing. And of course, because I'm a novelist, I'm allowed to make things up, whereas archaeologists, it's fascinating to work with them, because from a professional point of view, they have to stick very firmly to the material evidence that they have for everything that they publish. So that, you know, they're scientists, and they need hard evidence for the claims that they make about what they're finding. But as they're actually engaged in the act of digging, of excavation, their minds run riot, and they're constantly, you know, making things up and speculating about who was here and what was life like, and, you know, why did they build it here, and, you know, how did they make their livelihoods. And so actually they're constantly fictionalizing in their heads. They just don't write it down. So it's a great privilege to be able to be a writer and get a job like, you know, writing the blog, because I could make stuff up. But actually a lot of the time I was chatting away with the archaeologists, and they were making things up, and I would put it on the blog. So that was fun. And then the other big part of my research involved sailing. So Pytheas did this extraordinary voyage from the Mediterranean all the way. He circumnavigated Britain. He went as far as the Arctic, because we know that in some of the fragments from his book, which is lost, but it was widely quoted by lots of other geographers and historians in the ensuing few centuries. And so we know that he got to a place where the sea became slushy, and where he met huge animals that spout fumes out of the sea, so the great whales, and then he went to a place where the land burning came down to the sea, which we assume must be Iceland.
Yeah, of course.
All of which he was quoted as being a fantasist who was clearly trying to sort of pull the wool of sensible Mediterranean people's eyes, and that these things, you know, couldn't possibly really exist. But of course, we read it now and think, wow, that guy really did do an amazing voyage. And he then sailed to the Baltic as well. And so I wanted to go and see those places, and I wanted to experience the kind of the exploring, the journeying that he would have done. So I've sailed up in Svalbard, and me and my husband got completely hooked on sailing, and so we've done an awful lot of sailing in a small boat around the Minch and up to Orkney and so forth. And most of the book, in fact, got written at sea. I discovered that actually one of the best ways to imagine the Iron Age is to go out to sea in a small boat until all the houses and buildings and 21st century developments have shrunk to little dots on the landscape. And the landscape is just as it would have been when Pytheas arrived. And the sea is the same, and the winds are the same, and the tides are the same, and much of the wildlife is also the same. So it's actually really easy when you're on a little boat out in the sea to kind of conjure that world that Pytheas would have experienced. So that, I mean, people joke about the fact that this is kind of method writing or something, but it's actually, I find it really, really helpful, and it would lead to some really funny situations with my husband. You know, if it goes completely calm and you're on a sailing boat, I mean, we've got nylon sails and bits of steel and aluminium and stuff on the boat, but the basic physics of it is exactly the same as it would have been, you know. And when the wind dries away, then unless you've got a team of people to row, you don't go anywhere. You know, you just becalmed. And we've got a perfectly good engine on our 21st century boat, but I would refuse to use it on the basis that, well, Pytheas didn't know an engine, so, you know, in these circumstances he'd just be stuck. And so my husband would eventually prevail on me that, you know, like, there are limits to these things, and we would, you know, a certain number of hours of floating around in an Iron Age sort of situation, that is all well and good, but sometimes it's worth putting the engine on. So.
Well, that makes real sense, because I get the feeling right from the beginning that the life on sea is so vivid, and it almost feels like you're from the boat. And often you're on land looking at the boats and what's happening there, even if a lot of the action is on the boats. But this time round, it did seem to be viewed from the sea, and then there would be these drop-offs at various points. But really, the safety and the was when they were all back on boat. Even if they were being chased, they were still kind of, in their own little world back on those boats.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was the main highway, and
Yeah.
when you do take up sailing and start exploring around, then the geography of the whole of northern Scotland changes dramatically, and places that we consider to be very remote and difficult to get to from each other are actually really easy by sea. So from Assynt to North Skye, for example, is a ridiculously long drive all the way down to Kyle, kind of 3.5 hours down to Kyle, and then all the way up to up to North Skye, let alone the few places where you can actually make ferry connections out to islands and so forth. Whereas if you're in your own boat, then those places are really close, and much more accessible than they are in modern terms. And then the contrary can happen as well, that two places that you can get to quite easily by road on land in the modern day world can actually be really difficult to get between if you're actually having to navigate the currents and so forth on the sea. So yeah, the geography is quite different, and it's changed completely my perspective of this part of the world.
That's fascinating. So despite us talking mainly about Pytheas, this is really Rian's story, isn't it? We see her going from a young woman who is enslaved by the end to matriarch. So why was this the story you wanted to concentrate on? Why was it Rian's life?
Yeah, okay, so there's a kind of core idea at the heart of the trilogy, which is about it's about greed. In some fundamental way, I think. It's about the way in which trade starts to happen and become possible when objects are no longer specific to the individual who made them for their particular use, but become kind of generically swappable for other objects. And that there's a kind of process of individual individual consumption that goes beyond the bare necessities, which only starts to become visible in the archaeological record in the Iron Age. Right. Before then, pretty much people just only had the stuff that they needed to survive. And then you get some individuals who were clearly involved in conspicuous consumption in the Iron Age. And I'm interested in the way in which that comes about, because kind of consumption way beyond what we need seems to be a kind of defining issue of our age, as it were. And so I was kind of interested in that. And part of that no longer seeing each individual object as a sort of sacred thing in its own right, but being just interchangeable with other objects, is at the kind of heart of the idea of trade. And part of what was being traded at that point in the Iron Age is not only kind of gems and food stuffs and textiles and so forth, but also people. Yeah. And the very idea that you can trade a person and that you can buy and sell a person seems to me to be one of those kind of very important fundamental ideas that we need still to be looking at and questioning and trying to understand, because it's not gone. It just hasn't yet gone. And so it's quite interesting that, I mean, sort of also the idea that the sort of patriarchal idea that which become it's kind of wrapped up in that. I think the idea that you can that a man can possess a woman and do with her as he will is kind of part of that kind of complex of ideas that I wanted to explore, how those ideas might have originated and how they pan out within at the very early stages, I suppose, of that coming about. And those ideas, of course, are still really relevant today. And the whole Me Too movement was seemed to sort of arrive coincidentally with me writing this. And then it's been really interesting, actually, over the Black Lives Matter situation, that that consciousness that actually those fundamentally important ideas of treating people as chattels has still, we haven't lost it yet, and we still need to be challenging those ideas. So
Absolutely.
so it's those kind of concepts which they're still relevant today that made me kind of interested in that period as a place where we could kind of explore them at their earlier stage.
And partly because of the themes, what you've just spoken about, there are kind of heroes and villains in the book, but they seem to be a lot more nuanced than that. It was interesting by the time we got to the Lyre Dancers that the character of Usa, you start to have some sympathy for her, even though she was the one who first took Marina away. Was that important to you to kind of not just have like black hats and white hats, but to have some kind of grey areas in there?
Yeah, I think I'm fundamentally not really interested in views that turn the world into there are two kinds of people in this world, the good people and the bad people. I just think that's a really oversimplistic view of how we are as people, and we do genuinely. I've done a lot of research. My PhD was actually on disagreement and the fact that different bodies of people have got different value systems and ways of seeing the world, and it's very fundamental, I think. And if we insist that our particular perspective on the world is the only truth, then things can kind of go kind of badly wrong from that point onwards. And I don't think anybody has a monopoly on the truth, and that we genuinely need to understand that there is a diversity of different ways of seeing the world. And I also fundamentally believe that there's no such thing as people who are inherently and irredeemably bad. I've never kind of bought that idea, and I think that even people who do wicked things have probably there's probably reasons in their past why they're doing those wicked things, and understanding what underlies bad behavior, and how it might possibly be challenged and changed, I think is really important for us. That otherwise, you just write people off when they're criminal or something, and I just don't buy that. So I kind of I really enjoyed writing Usa. I mean, she's a real baddie. She was a real villain, and for me it was really important also that the kind of main villain of the piece is a woman as well. I think that it would have been far too easy just to have kind of nice Celtic women being harassed by nasty men, and that would be far too simplistic. And so I really wanted to explore the differences of, and the possibilities of change.
And part of the ways that people do change by the time we get to the Lyre Dancers is the passing of time and growing older, and things not having the same power that maybe they had to begin with. I mean, it's the end of things, but in some ways it's the beginning of other things as well. But so was it that looking at a life over that time, not just one life but a few, because characters are there all the way through, was that something that you wanted to do?
It wasn't originally what I intended when I set out, but I got really intrigued by what happened with Rhiann when she became a mother, and what that involved, and I think one of the things in my own personal life, I've never been a mother, and it's kind of one of the reasons I think that I write is actually because as a sort of compensation for the fact that I've not been able to be a mother, but I have been a daughter, and so I understand the kind of that mother-daughter relationship, but only from the perspective of being a daughter within it, and I'm a sister, and so forth, and so I was conscious writing Rhiann that I was writing her as a mother, a role that I didn't know, and yet I kind of could imagine what it was like to be her daughter, and so the Lyre Dancers kind of came about partly, I think, because I wanted to explore what she would be like as a mother from the daughter's perspective, and and then that became multiple perspectives, of course,
Yeah.
because she has more than one daughter, and that in itself became an interesting part of the dynamic. But yeah, I guess perhaps also where I'm at in my life is, as you said, you know, years pass, people grow older, people change, and that seemed to be something that if I was going to be doing something on such a big scale, that needed to be part of it.
Because, I mean, Usa in particular, when we first meet her in The Walrus Murderer, it's such a strong kind of entrance. And then by the end, there's a kind of pathos and sadness about what she has become. This might be a weird comparison, but it reminded me in The Godfather of you see the young Corleone, you know, and who's full of kind of deceit and violence and all that thing, and then by the end you've got Marlon Brando in the garden with his granddaughter, and it's this kind of, as you say, people change. People are not one thing. They are not defined by one thing ever, really.
Yeah.
And I think also the Lyre Dancers, as you say, it is so much about family, and a kind of extended family as well. I mean, I often think by the end, Usa is almost part of that family.
Yeah. Well, of course she is, in the sense that she's related to Mannigan.
Well,
so,
that's the other thing. Yeah, you've got
Yeah.
all these weird, unlikely. Well, you've got, I don't want to give anything away, but there are some revelations at the very end about relationships, which are kind of are quite shocking to those who uncover them. And it's interesting, that view of the daughter's view on the mother, because there are quite a lot of chapters which are the daughter's points of view. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
So how did you, this might be difficult, how do you approach a character at the beginning? Do they lead you with how they go through it, or do you have an idea of where they'll go? Do you know what I mean?
No, they make themselves up. It's a very peculiar process, I find. But yeah, they seem to have their own. Yeah, they seem to have their own life. I mean, the joke is that, you know, for years I've been in my shed, with a whole bunch of fictional and imaginary friends, and then for this trilogy I was on a small boat where it was me, my husband, and then a whole bunch of imaginary age characters kind of doing their own thing, and so yeah, I do find that really intriguing. That it takes me a long time. I write quite slowly, and I generally let them do what they're going to do, and they can surprise me, which is intriguing. I find it a little bit
that must be an odd thing.
Yeah, I mean, it must be a subconscious kind of process that's going on. I don't believe it's some sort of divine telling or something. Though I've got people who sort of say, no, you're channeling something from sort of some collective unconscious or something. But so I don't really understand how that works. But I just know that it does work, and that the characters make up their own story.
I wonder if it's almost like, actors talk about researching a character and getting their backstory before they can go and do it. And maybe because you're with them all that time, you're almost researching, you have a better idea than anyone else where they're going to go, but it is subconscious, perhaps. I don't know. It's really interesting.
No, that's right. Yeah. And it would be really interesting when, one of the wonderful things about the books being out in the world, having carried them around in my head and on paper for so long, is that I have that thing where the classic example is meeting a really nice hairy black cow and thinking Rianne would really like that cow, because she likes, she's into cows, and finally now I can actually kind of, if I'm with somebody, I can point to the cow and go, Rianne would really like that cow, and they know what I mean, and then finally, whereas for years people would just kind of go, your imaginary friend would like that cow, right, and you kind of feel that you're not far off a straitjacket sometimes.
Well, I mean, you've spent so much time with these characters, and as readers like myself, are you going to miss them?
Yeah, well, they're kind of still here, so yeah, but they do feel very, very real, and I mean, I've had some amazing experiences. One, for example, I read at the Wigton Book Festival, and for the gig, it was in the Whithorn Iron Age roundhouse.
Oh.
They've reconstructed a roundhouse down at Whithorn. Fantastic. I mean, it's just, you know, it's exactly as it would have been, and the hosts for the event were in full Iron Age costume.
Oh,
And
wow.
and we had a fire going, and we all sat around the fireside, and they were kind of, you know, they were weaving textiles as we talked, and it was just, and it was, you know, you're in that situation, and it feels as though, you know, you can read it, and it's as though the real people have walked into that space, and you know, so situations like that make it feel like, yeah, they're real people somehow. So although I kind of miss them, I also don't miss them because they're still about somehow.
Yeah.
So yeah.
You've mentioned a little bit about what you wanted to comment on in the modern world. Was there anything else that, even though you'd set it in the Iron Age, there was things that are happening today that you thought that, you know, are there?
Yeah, I guess I've kind of already mentioned the main issues there, the slavery issue, the need to understand people of different cultures, and I mean, I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Iron Age. I think both in terms of, I mean, I think one of the things that quite a lot of people like about my writing is that I'm very interested in how people subsisted at that time. So there's a lot of detail of precisely which herbs you would use as medicine for precisely what's wrong, precisely which food you would be, you know, going out and collecting from the woods at that particular time of year, and you know, so a lot of that work is very, very detailed in research, that it matters that she goes out and she's digging pig nuts because it is, you know, June, and that's what you would be able to pick in large quantities at that time of year, and so forth. And I think that we could learn a lot actually about how to value the natural environment that we have in Scotland, and all of the wild food that grows here that people would have been able to eat then, and kind of the ways in which people lived basically a much more sustainable life then, by understanding and having a much richer knowledge of the natural world, and how it could support them. And I think in our urbanized society, we've lost track of an awful lot of that, and think that, you know, if you're not importing tomatoes from Spain or wherever, then there's nothing to eat, you know, and it's not like that. So I think that's
kind of one of the things that I took from it was you know, recently there's been a move to foraging and all of this, but the idea that you understand how you can subside on what's around you, but also understanding the changes in season, and even down to the changes in tides, and just understanding what's happening to the land, that you are part of that, and it is part of you, and there's this relationship which is not separate as we might think.
No, that's right. And I think, you know, there has been a history of history, as it were, that was dominated by the literate so-called civilizations that mean that you know, from the Greeks, and then the Romans, and the whole Roman invasion, and everything that else is the subsequent history of the British Isles, has tended to lead to a narrative whereby civilization came from the Mediterranean to Britain, and there was a whole bunch of grunting savages that have kind of gradually been civilized. And I think that all the evidence is that is absolutely false.
Yeah.
And that there was you know, highly sophisticated society has been in this part of the world for thousands of years. And that there was certainly one of the things we've done in the projects here around the Iron Age is we've done everything from you know, making pots to doing textiles to and lots of feasts. We've had lots of Iron Age feasting going on, and I think people have kind of reached the conclusion that actually life wasn't so bad. You know, I mean, there was actually really a good diversity of foodstuffs, and people probably actually had a relatively comfortable life. Yeah, okay, we didn't have Netflix and all the rest of it, but it's not like people were somehow sort of deeply deprived. and their knowledge, certainly of the landscape and of navigation and so forth, was really sophisticated. And so when the idea that somehow Pytheas was a sort of civilized man coming to a whole bunch of barbarians is, I just really wanted to reject that idea and say, no, come on, there's a civilization here that that was just as profound and important.
I think that's interesting, because one of the things that struck me when I started reading the books was it takes a while to get your head around that, because you have this idea that, you know, it's kind of woad cover, almost savages, you know, and here comes someone to save them. I know you almost think, is this fantasy? Because then you start to realize, oh no, it's not, it's history. But it's just not the history that you might expect from other sources.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's a very important narrative. And I don't think it, to be quite honest, I don't think it's completely gone away, that somehow people who live close to the land are more primitive, more stupid, I mean, than people who are urbanized and sophisticated and materialistic. And I just think, like, oh, well, let's get rid of that. Yeah, that's not true. Yeah.
So what's next for you? Can you say, you know, is it top secret, or are you working on something else?
I'm not writing a novel at the moment, which is interesting. When I finished this, it was such a big project, it lasted for years, and put so much into it that I didn't immediately want to embark on another big one. And I've been doing lots of poetry. So I'm supposed to be poet in residence at Inverview Garden. I was last year and had some like 5 brilliant sessions of several weeks down in Inverview, and which is a brilliant location. I love it. It's about 100 miles by land, but it's one of those places less than 30 miles by sea from home. And so I'm writing lots of poetry is the short answer, and doing lots of interesting things, playing with words in interesting ways, doing little things. And at some point, I've got 2 other kind of projects that I will get to at some point. One of them is a historical thing, but set in late 18th century Vienna, which is odd and very difficult. So where that will go is anybody's guess, but I've done quite a lot of work and research and things around that, but I haven't written anything which I'm satisfied with yet. And that, for various reasons, probably can't be a novel because it needs a soundtrack. And then there's another thing which is set in the future, because I've written one novel set in the future called Bear Witness, and I might need to go back to the future again for another project. So. And people keep asking me, is there another book? Like you said, by the time you get to the end of the Lyre Dancers, then other things are starting to happen, and is there more of that? And at the moment there isn't.
Right.
So, but
it would be interesting if that was the case. I have to say, I kind of already missed some of the characters as well. They're so vivid. And I must say though that the end of the Lyre Dancers, you know, if you're going to leave people on a high, it's one of the most the Lyre dance itself is one of the most joyous things to read. It was, you feel you're really there with them. Well,
no, great. I mean, that came about archaeologically as well, because of the fact that, I mean, the split rock is the iconic image of the Ascent Crofters, you know, and that, you know, from the buyout onwards, and on top of the split rock, there is this vitrified rock, which is interesting and mysterious. I mean, it's been fired through a very intensive fire in the Iron Age, and why and how and stuff is kind of anybody's guess. So it was really up for grabs as to what went on there. So I had to use it, and it became that piece at the end of the book. And it's been really nice, actually. People have said, quite a few people who've read it have said that in the sort of the worries of the lockdown and so forth, they found it a hopeful kind of a hopeful thing to read, which has been really nice. That makes me feel good that people have got some hope out of it.
No, absolutely. And partly it's just so nice to be taken to another place and another time and just, spend time with your characters. Mandy, I think that is the perfect place to leave it. So thank you so much for talking to us today.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. You're a lovely person to talk to, so thank you. Thanks for having me.
We will be back soon with someone completely different.